to China in 2010 over this subject. They improved just a little bit, but as of July 10th, there's still 1,267 nationals waiting for repatriation, and only Cuba is worse. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a good amendment. It would put the heat on them to accept that, and I could go on at great length by victim stories and the Boston Globe and so forth, but I can tell you're getting anxious. I would just conclude by saying, really, this has got to be confronted. It's time to stop it. Senator Specter, before he left, had an amendment that would be very strong on this issue. I think it's something of a bipartisan issue, and I would ask your support for the amendment.
Senator Schumer.
Well, first let me say, Mr. Chairman, Senator Sessions talks about a very real problem, and we should do something about it. Present law is totally handcuffed, so all of these countries that won't take back people we want to deport, we have no sanctions against them. That is absolutely right, and it is wrong, and we ought to have sanctions. Now, the problem I have with my colleague's amendment is I don't think his sanctions are as effective. We were aware of this problem when we put together our legislation and put in a really tough sanction, which is, and I think it gets right to the heart of it, what Senator Sessions, what we propose is if they don't take the people we're asking to be deported, they lose their diplomatic visas to this country. That goes right to the government officials who are doing this. The government officials who are doing this are doing it for their own purposes. Senator Sessions' amendment says charge a 5% fee on visas. That doesn't hurt the Chinese government. China's the biggest offender, as you mentioned, 12,000 people. It hurts the tourists. So some tourist or business person who wants to come is going to pay 5% more on their visas. And I don't think that affects the Chinese government. It will affect maybe tourism or travel to the United States. But if you tell the Chinese you're losing your diplomatic visas, which they need for their trade and diplomacy and everything else, that'll hit them where it hurts. So I would just urge my colleague, who brings up a correct problem that needs solving, that has no solution in law now, to look at our solution, which I think will actually get to the point of a very real problem. I don't dispute it, and we need to do something about it. But taking away the diplomatic visas of the offending country goes right to the government that's doing it, not to the citizenry who are just coming in on tourist visas.
I failed to mention, Senator Schumer, that there appears to be real constitutional questions about the ability of Congress to constrict the right of the President to communicate international affairs with visas and so forth, and they haven't done that to date. So as a fallback, I think the penalties that I've listed would be helpful too. I have my doubts about whether that...
I'd like to propose a solution to my colleague.
All right.
Okay? Let's add to this bill, and we'll work on language, that if this solution doesn't work for the constitutional reasons you stated, we think it will work, we'll use your solution. Okay?
Good. That sounds like a fair solution. And I would note that you've got to have a will to make this happen, and our government already has the authority and powers to fix it, but it's been slow to use those powers. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just ask you, we'll put together an amendment and just add it with unanimous consent later. So, okay?
I would agree.
So the amendment is withdrawn?
I will withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. Then well, we might get done before 11 tonight. I appreciate cooperation, everybody. Next is Senator Franken, number 7.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On December 12, 2006, Immigration and Custom Enforcement carried out enforcement actions in Colorado, Iowa, Minnesota.
Objection. The quorum call is suspended. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. I'm sorry. Morning business is now closed, and under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of S-954, which the clerk will report.
calendar number 73 S954, a bill to reauthorize agricultural programs through 2018.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that Kevin Norton, a detailee to our committee, and Heather Arnold, John Newton, and Eric Hansen, fellows for the committee, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the debate on S954, the Agricultural Reform, Food and Jobs Act.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I first want to thank our majority leader and the Republican leader and all the members for allowing us in the Senate to move forward today on this very important bill. And I want to thank my ranking member, Senator Thad Cochran, for his friendship and his leadership. And I want to thank all of the members of the committee for working together to write this important legislation. And also, I want to thank our staff on both sides of the aisle. We have excellent staff that have worked together, and I know will continue to work together as we move this legislation through. Mr. President, our bill, the Agricultural Reform, Food and Jobs Act, is critical to the 16 million Americans whose jobs rely on a strong agricultural economy. Agriculture has been one of the bright spots as our economy is getting back on track. In fact, it is one of the few areas where we actually have a trade surplus, where we're exporting more than we're importing. And this means jobs for us in America. The Farm Bill really is a jobs bill. It's a jobs bill, it's a trade bill, it's a reform bill, it's a conservation bill, and it's a kitchen table bill. Because thanks to the Farm Bill, families all across America will sit down around a table tonight and enjoy the bounty of the world's safest, most abundant, and most affordable food supply in the world. And those who need temporary help to feed their families during an economic crisis will get help as well. Because this is a bill that reflects our best values as Americans. It's easy to take agriculture for granted. It's easy for many of us to forget that the food we eat doesn't just come from the supermarket, like I think some folks may think. The food we eat comes from the skill and the efforts of men and women who work hard from sunrise to sunset, day in and day out, to put food on our tables. And too often, I believe we take them for granted as well. Most of us don't have to worry about how many days it's been since the last rainfall, or whether or not it's going to freeze in May after the fruit trees are blooming. Most of us don't have to worry about decisions and weather conditions around the world and how it affects our livelihood here at home. And that's why we have what we call the Farm Bill. We have a Farm Bill because farmers are in the riskiest business in the world. We saw that last year as our country was in the grip of the worst drought in generations. We saw as ranchers had to cull their herds because they couldn't get enough food or water for their cattle. We saw all across the country as farmers lost their crops in late spring freezes that wiped out cherry and apple crops in Michigan and other parts of the country. And that's why the top goal of the Agricultural Reform Bill is risk management. We're reforming farm programs, ending direct payments and other subsidies that have no relationship to risk, and instead giving farmers market-based risk management tools. That is the hallmark of this Farm Bill. We want to make sure that a farm that's been passed down for generations doesn't face bankruptcy because of a drought or other events outside the farmer's control. We also want to make sure that when there's a drought, we are conserving our precious soil and water resources. When it comes to conservation, the Farm Bill is risk management for the whole country. Conservation programs in the Farm Bill make sure that our soil doesn't blow away and that our waters aren't polluted by runoff. In many parts of the country, last year we had a drought that was worse than the Dust Bowl. But we didn't have a Dust Bowl. We didn't have out-of-control erosion, and that's because the Farm Bill did what it was supposed to do in conservation. Soil stayed on the ground. It's easy to take that for granted as well. The Farm Bill is our country's largest investment in land and water conservation on private lands. And the Farm Bill gives farmers tools to strengthen wildlife habitat. I had the opportunity this weekend with my gracious host, the senator from Mississippi, to visit a program, a wildlife reserve and wetlands reserve program, and Senator Cochran is responsible for those parts of the Farm Bill. We had an opportunity to go out on a beautiful piece of flat land in the Mississippi Delta and see where ducks were coming back, quail were coming back. Habitat was beginning to flourish because of efforts to support these important resources for the future. And the farmer involved in the property said he felt he was in partnership with the USDA, was making a commitment for his children and future generations through conservation. I think this is a real source of pride for us as we look at this 5-year Farm Bill. I'm pleased that the bill before us includes a new historic agreement between conservation groups and commodity groups around conservation and crop insurance. These folks, from very different perspectives, sat down together, listened to one another, and worked out an agreement that will preserve water and land resources for generations to come. The Farm Bill helps farmers improve 1.9 million acres of land for wildlife habitat. And healthy wildlife habitats and clean, fishable waters are not only good for our environment, but they also support hunting and fishing and all the other great outdoor recreation that benefits our economy and creates jobs, and we just plain have fun doing it in Michigan, Mr. President. In fact, outdoor recreation supports over 6 million jobs alone, and that's a big deal. We also continue our support for specialty crops, fruits and vegetables, and those crops that make up about half of the cash receipts of the country, and organic agriculture, a growing part of agriculture. We expand farmers markets and local food hubs to encourage schools and businesses to support their local farmers by purchasing locally grown food, creating more local jobs. And we expand the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in schools and community food programs that are so essential. We also strengthen rural development financing for small businesses. You know, once you get outside of the cities in Michigan and all across our country, every single community in Michigan outside of our big cities gets support for jobs through something we call rural development. Financing for small businesses, for water and sewer projects, road projects, housing efforts for families, a whole wide variety of things that we do through this economic arm in the USDA called rural development. And we also expand the energy title to encourage support for new jobs in bio-based manufacturing, which is an exciting new effort. In addition to biofuels, we now can use agricultural products and byproducts to replace petroleum and other chemicals in manufacturing. And there's a huge new opportunity for jobs, as well as supporting our environment by doing these things. So there's no doubt that the Farm Bill is a jobs bill. This bill also continues to focus on the issue that has taken so much of our time this year and last year and the year before, and that is cutting the deficit and getting our nation's fiscal house back in order. We get rid of unnecessary subsidies like the direct payment program that sends a check to folks regardless of whether they're even farming a particular crop anymore. We're streamlining programs to cut red tape and cracking down on fraud and abuse. And in fact, we eliminate over 100 different programs or authorizations that either were duplicating something else or just didn't make sense to do anymore. And I think that's really the way we ought to be cutting spending and creating savings. And altogether, including the cuts that took effect already this year, we're able to cut spending by about $24 billion. That's more than double the cuts proposed by Simpson-Bowles Commission and last year's Gang of Six that worked on deficit reduction. And, Mr. President, I want to underscore that this is four times more than is required by the arbitrary across-the-board sequestration cut. So we in agriculture take the backseat to no one in a commitment to do our part to make tough decisions, set priorities to reduce the deficit. This bill represents the most significant reform of American agriculture in decades, in my judgment. We're putting caps on payments to farmers and closing loopholes that allowed people who weren't actually farming to receive payments. We're strengthening crop insurance, which we heard from farmers is the #1 risk management tool for them. And it's important that we strengthen it and protect it as we move through this process. The agricultural reform bill includes disaster assistance for our ranchers and farmers as well who cannot receive crop insurance, livestock owners and others in areas that cannot receive crop insurance. We made sure our food assistance programs are accountable, that there's integrity in our programs, that we continue to build on the integrity that's already there by cracking down on abuses and misuse. And we made sure our changes would not remove one single needy family. It's not about hurting folks, it's about making sure that there's not abuse. And that's what we address. And let me say that when we look at crop insurance, that's there for disasters for a farmer. It goes up when there's a lot of disasters, that's when there's costs, and then it goes down when things are going better. And it's the same thing for food assistance for families. Costs go up during bad times that we've seen the last number of years, and now during the length of this farm bill, CBO tells us those costs are going down. Why? Because the economy is getting better and people are able to go back to work. That's how it's supposed to work, and that's how it's working. Last year, we in the Senate passed a farm bill with strong bipartisan support. We didn't take the 16 million Americans who work in agriculture for granted. We didn't take our land and forests and water resources for granted. And we stood up for families all across the country who had fallen on hard times. Unfortunately, at that time, Mr. President, as you know, the House of Representatives did not follow our lead. They allowed the Farm Bill to expire at the end of last year, which is why we are here again working through this process. I appreciate the way we've gotten to this point in a bipartisan way. We have worked very, very hard to make sure every part of agriculture is addressed in terms of their needs and risk management tools in this bill. I want to thank my colleague from Mississippi, Senator Cochran, who is the ranking member of our committee, and he and his staff have worked diligently and in a bipartisan way, and that has caused us to be able to get to this point, and I want to say thank you for that. I'm looking forward to working with colleagues to pass this bill as soon as possible, and we look forward to working with colleagues on amendments throughout this week. I see my distinguished colleague that I will turn to our ranking member in just a moment, but I do want to place one amendment in order at this point, and then we can proceed with our discussions, one that we have cleared on both sides. And on behalf of Senator Cantwell, I would call up Amendment 919.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Michigan, Ms. Stabenow, for Ms. Cantwell, proposes an amendment numbered 919.
I would ask consent further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
And thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the opportunity now to turn to my friend and a great agricultural leader in the Senate. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Mississippi.
Mr. President, I'm flattered by the kind remarks of the distinguished senator from Michigan. I am pleased and honored to serve with her on the Senate Agriculture Committee. She chairs that committee with a sense of responsibility for the subject matter, which is very important to our nation's farmers and all the consumers in America as well, but also to the fellow members of our committee, Republicans and Democrats, who serve on the committee and who have worked together to put a bill before the Senate that continues to authorize programs of the federal government that benefit landowners and those who work to conserve the resources of soil and water that help nurture
our great agriculture sector. It produces a bountiful amount of fruits and vegetables and marketable commodities that are sold in international trade at competitive prices. It is a great success story. I'm tempted to say a great American success story, and it truly is. It is the backbone of our nation's economy. So it's serious business. At the same time, it provides jobs, food to eat, grain to harvest, to export, cotton and the fibers that come from it that clothe and dress millions of people in our nation and around the world. So bringing this bill to the floor is a point of achievement, and with gratitude we point out the leadership of the distinguished chairman. Without her strong leadership and her keen sense of awareness of how to manage legislation like this and present it to the Senate as she has just done is quite impressive. And we are very fortunate to have her serving in this capacity. We have recommended a bill that contains some major reforms of the farm programs that come within the jurisdiction of our committee. For example, the bill reduces authorized spending by $24 billion. It includes $6 billion in sequestration cuts. Now, these represent real savings. We know that we have been confronting a deficit crisis, a fiscal policy management crisis, and this bill does its part. And with the authority it has over the law governing the subject matter, we have moved to eliminate direct payments to farmers, which has amounted in the past to $40 billion. There are reforms in this legislation of the crop insurance title. The bill recommends adoption of reforms that limit payments to producers. Conservation programs have been streamlined in this legislation and consolidated. The committee has crafted reforms in the nutrition title to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. These are big challenges. And these challenges have been met with a recognition that there are people who need the support of programs like this. School children who are attending school and getting the benefit of reduced price and in some cases free meals at school have made major contributions to the quality of work, the degree and level of education that the children are able to absorb and benefit from, and it's tied to these programs. The committee has dealt with conservation, I've mentioned, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and throughout, the bill reflects a broad bipartisan level of support and an approach that accommodates interests represented by all the members of our committee. So I think we have produced, with the leadership of the chairman, a responsible but fair bill. And I'm pleased to recommend the Senate that it approves the bill. It deserves our support.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss one of the most important and significant reforms of our nation's agriculture in decades, the Agricultural Reform, Food and Jobs Act of 2013, known around here as the Farm Bill, is the product of months and months of policy discussion, late-night deliberations. Special thanks to the chair of the committee, Senator Stabenow from Michigan, and the ranking member, Senator Cochran of Mississippi. I thank them both for their good work on this, and special thanks to Catherine Ferguson in my office for her good work on this legislation. There's a reason people across the country, farmers and business owners and faith leaders and county commissioners, are paying attention to this legislation. It's a farm bill, it's a food bill, it's a nutrition bill, it's an economic development bill, it's a rural development bill, it's a conservation bill all at once. In my state, 1 out of 7 jobs is related to food and agriculture. To keep our economy moving forward, the Farm Bill must remain a priority here in Congress. We did our job last year in this legislation. The House of Representatives unfortunately didn't, but I think will this year when we passed overwhelmingly a similar bill to this by a vote of 64 to 35. The bill saves more than $20 billion while maintaining important investments in conservation and nutrition and renewable energy and agriculture research, so important to my state, to rural development, to broadband, all of those things that farm legislation can in fact do for rural development. In the last 2 years, the Senate's considered reform bills that have done more than any farm bill, literally, I think, in 20 years. We've eliminated direct payments and recoupled eligibility for crop insurance with the expectation that farmers do right by the land. The work of the Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Cochran in committee to keep that coalition together, linking crop insurance with conservation, was especially important. We set tight limits on the amount of support any individual producer can receive. There's obviously more that can be done, but this bill makes important strides in reforming our farm program. It will increase efforts to improve water quality. In Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes, the greatest body of fresh water anywhere in the world, important even perhaps more so to Chairwoman Stabenow's state even than mine. It will help small towns like Bryan and Bucyrus and Belair make strategic economic development investments to jumpstart their local economies. It continues efforts to make sure Americans have enough to eat, have access to affordable, healthy, fresh food. It's a forward-looking bill. I'm pleased to support it in committee and hope to work with Senate colleagues in both parties in the coming days to make slight improvements as it moves forward. The centerpiece of the bill's deficit reduction efforts are rooted in reform of the farm safety net. The era of direct payments made annually regardless of need is over. Across Ohio and across the nation, we've heard that crop insurance is the most important tool farmers have for managing risks, so this bill improves and preserves crop insurance. We know what that meant last year, particularly as drought hit states like Ohio and more severely states west of my state. Farmers have said they want a leaner, more efficient, market-oriented farm safety net. Taxpayers deserve that, too. Last year, Senator Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, and Durbin and Lugar and I proposed the Aggregate Risk and Revenue Management Program, ARMS, streamlining the farm safety net, making it more market-oriented. Instead, the new Ag Risk Coverage Program will work with crop insurance to provide farmers the tools they need to manage risk, making payments only when farmers need them most. This program is market-oriented. It relies on current data. It's more responsive to farmers' needs. It's more responsive to taxpayers. The bill reforms a number of long-standing unjustifiable practices. For the first time, this farm bill ends payments to landowners who have nothing to do with farm management. It ends payments to millionaires. It puts a firm cap on how much support any farmer can receive from the direct farm support programs each year. This so-called conservation compliance provision reflects a landmark agreement put forward by a number of key commodity and conservation interests and stakeholders. If you're going to receive federally subsidized crop insurance, you need to show you're meeting basic conservation requirements. Again, the days of subsidies without conditions and subsidies without responsibility are over. It's an example of what can happen when groups with different perspectives, the commodities farmers and the conservationists, come together to listen to each other. By relinking crop insurance subsidies with good environmental practices, this bill makes our farm safety net more defensible and protects our natural resources. As I said, this farm bill makes great strides towards better, leaner, smart farm policy. But it's also a work in progress. A key difference between this year's bill versus the one we passed last year is the inclusion of the Adverse Markets Payment, the AMP program, that, to be candid, is something important to Southern growers, but not in line with what I believe Ohioans want to see and what I hear from Ohio farmers. I work closely with colleagues from the middle of the country to make sure this AMP program is as market-oriented as possible, but it was a battle not wholly won and something I want to see modified. We can't have farm programs in one part of the country become more market-oriented while others do not. The Agriculture Reform, Food and Jobs Act supports farmers, but also produces a life-saving safety net to American families who have fallen on hard times. The SNAP program now serves 47 million Americans, more than half of whom are children and seniors. Along with unemployment insurance, SNAP is the primary form of assistance we provide Americans who've fallen on tough times. And just understand and be certain, many of these families are people with full-time and part-time jobs that simply don't make enough money to get along. Some of my colleagues will point out the rapid increase in SNAP enrollment over the past few years. This is to be expected since it mirrors the downturn in the economy, the unemployment levels, and the fact that for 10 years, most people in this country haven't had a raise. As costs go up, they haven't seen their incomes go up. It hits people in the lowest income people the hardest, and that's the biggest reason that people have relied on food stamps. This is evidence that SNAP's working. Our economy continues to recover. SNAP enrollment will decrease. More telling is that today some 50 million Americans still live under the federal poverty level. The number of Americans who rely on SNAP tells me that we shouldn't be gutting, we shouldn't be undercutting like a number of my colleagues in the House of Representatives want to do. We shouldn't be cutting federal nutrition programs. What we should be doing is enacting better economic policies that create jobs and reduce inequality and enable Americans to put food on the table without assistance. This bill cuts $4 billion from SNAP. That's already $4 billion too much. It goes without saying, though, and I appreciate the chairwoman's efforts here to make that $4 billion cut as painless as possible in terms of benefits that SNAP beneficiaries receive. Again, most of these, a huge number of these SNAP beneficiaries are in working families. A huge number of them are children. A huge number of them are senior citizens. It goes without saying that a bill with the level of cuts to SNAP, some $20 billion included in the House bill, won't get my support and won't pass muster in the Senate. While we work to preserve SNAP, we can also make our nutrition programs work smarter. The Farm Bill makes important strides toward aligning our food and our farm and our economic policy. Agriculture has always been an economic engine of growth. An important engine of economic growth. I said at the outset, 1 out of 7 jobs in my state is related to agriculture and food. Shortening the supply chain benefits farmers and families. It helps keep, meaning that the more people eat that's grown locally, the better it is for the economy, the better it is for their health, the better it is for the environment. It helps keep money in the local economy. It helps build the economy, especially of rural communities in my state and across the country. This bill affects every American every day. It's a deficit reduction bill. It's a jobs bill. It's a bipartisan economic relief bill. I again commend Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Cochran for their work in crafting this legislation. I especially appreciate the staff, for individual members and the committee staff for their work. I urge my colleagues to work together and halt the impasse that keeps us from making progress on this legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Before the senator from Ohio leaves, I want to thank him. He has been an invaluable member of our committee. We wouldn't have the agricultural risk coverage portion, the yield loss coverage portion of this bill if it were not for his work. He and Senator Thune working together. We used their bill as the basis for this. He's also been the champion on rural development. We have investments in rural development we wouldn't have had without his involvement, as well as other efforts in the energy title and throughout the bill. So I just want to thank him, and we're very lucky to have him as a member of the committee.
President.
Senator from Mississippi.
I ask unanimous consent that Nona McCoy and Kevin Boutte, who have been detailed to my staff, be granted floor privileges for the balance of the Farm Bill debate.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And while the Senate is in a quorum call waiting for members to come to the floor and working on the Farm Bill today, just to let you know that later today they're expecting to debate 2 judicial nominations. Votes on those nominations expected to start at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. And while they're in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we'll take you over to the Senate committee that's marking up the immigration bill right now.
Do have it, and the next amendment is one by Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Chairman. This is amendment number 10, and I've made some technical corrections on it. I'll be as brief as I can.
Excuse me, do you have an amendment to the amendment, or are your technical changes included?
Yes, second-degree amendment.
Without objection.
Second-degree amendment.
If there's no objection, without objection, the amendment of the senator from Alabama will be amended by his second degree, and that's what's before the committee. Go ahead.
One of the things I've discovered in the last several years is that the fundamental principle that I think almost every nation adheres to is that an immigrant should not normally be admitted who's not able to be self-sustaining. If they can't establish that they will be self-sustaining but will become a public charge or dependent on the government benefits to survive, then they should not be admitted. That's a sound principle. It serves the national interest. It should be consistently applied across the board and people treated fairly under that standard. Under the present law, however, public assistance has been eroded, the definition of it, and so under current law, you can receive a host of benefits, but you're only denied entry as being unable to sustain yourself if you are going to be expected to receive temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, and supplemental security income. So those are the only 2 programs that qualify as being dependent on the government. Of course, there are 80-some-odd welfare programs. That does not make much sense. Secondly, we found that even there, nobody is checking. People are in the country lawfully, but they don't meet the standards of being able to sustain themselves. And this is one of the reasons we've had as much controversy as we have about welfare assistance to immigrants. We haven't done a good job up front of analyzing whether or not a person has the opportunity or the ability to be successful in America. I would note, my colleagues, that under the RPI status, everybody that's here today illegally would get RPI status regardless of whether or not they will be a public charge. That's in your legislation. My amendment does not change that. Although, in effect, we all ought to know that what we're doing is we're saying that persons who would not have been admitted otherwise that came legally, illegally, will be given permanent resident status, a path to citizenship, even though they do not meet this fundamental requirement. But my amendment only goes to the future, and it says that adds 2 temporary assistance for needy families and supplemental security income, 2 additional programs, Medicaid and the SNAP program. If you're going to qualify for those and you can't, then you should be defined as not being able to sustain yourself and should not be admitted initially. Did I make that clear? So the fundamental point of this is to state explicitly in the law that if your income level is expected to be at the level that qualifies you for Medicaid or SNAP benefits, then you should not be admitted in the first place in the future for new immigrants.
Senator Feinstein, you had a question?
Well, just a question, if I may, Mr. Chairman of Senator Sessions. If I understand this, you're saying that if a female is here and happens to be pregnant and needs the help of a hospital and is paid for with Medicaid monies, that's it.
No, Senator Feinstein. The intent of my amendment is to say that if you're applying to enter into the United States, an evaluation of your job prospects indicates that you don't have an ability to take care of yourself, then you shouldn't be admitted.
Right.
So it's up front when you're evaluated for admission, and it spells out in more detail what those standards should be, because they've basically been ignored today. Everybody comes in. Less than 0.2% of the people who apply to come into our country lawfully are turned down because they don't have income prospects sufficient to take care of themselves.
Yes.
Madam.
Let me, if I just
Yeah,
could
please,
for one
please.
second. But here's the problem. You don't know when you come in what might happen to you. People have all kinds of different turns in their lives. They experience all kinds of different things, an automobile accident, a cancer, whatever it is. So you're saying under no circumstances, if you receive any kind of a payment, I mean, we're not talking about going on regular welfare benefits, disability benefits, any of those things, but a real emergency. And you don't have the money to pay for it.
I totally understand your concern, and that's one of the things I think we all need to be realistic about. People in our country who come here get in real trouble, we're going to take care of them. We need to know that up front. And that's one of the things I worry about it. But what I would just say to you again, this amendment does not apply to that. If the person can show they have a realistic opportunity to be financially sustainable in the United States and then something bad happens, it would not bar them from getting assistance.
Thank you.
It's just designed to try to put more pressure and teeth on the reviewing officials to insist that people who come here have a prospect to be successful and not end up in a big city in poverty and not be able to take care of themselves.
Thank you. Yes, please, Senator.
No, that was amazing.
Senator
Madam
Durbin.
Chair?
Senator Sessions, let me give you a hypothetical. Undocumented mother, daughter born in the United States. She's a citizen. The daughter is. The undocumented mother applies for RPI status, comes forward, says, I'm prepared to wait my turn 10 years, 13 years, whatever it may be. Her daughter gets sick. Daughter goes to the hospital and is covered by Medicaid. The daughter is a citizen. That Medicaid benefit is to the benefit of that mother and that family. What I read your amendment to say is the mother is now ineligible because the daughter received Medicaid treatment at the hospital.
Correct.
No, the mother would need to show before she can come into the country that...
She's already here.
No.
Well, if she's an RPI, she would qualify. It does not apply to the 11...
Wouldn't renew.
She goes from RPI to green card status, and during that period of time, she is in alien status on her way to citizenship, and her daughter just received a Medicaid benefit because she was treated at the emergency room of a hospital.
And would my colleague yield?
Yes.
It would also apply even if she were RPI, because this applies to renewal, and we have the RPIs renew after 6 years, so we can make sure
Well, if it does, I'd be prepared to change that. I don't think it does. Explicitly, the way I hope we wrote it, and I believe we did, was to simply require in the future flow into the country, not any of those that are chosen to be able to stay here and get on a legal path.
I don't believe that's how it's written.
I see this as a practical matter. Children and pregnant women are the ones most apt to be harmed by this amendment. I will oppose it. Does the senator want to voice?
Senator Schumer, I think you raised one of your points is valid about the LPR
About time.
status, and I've acknowledged your good points and your bad. But I'd be willing to work on that. But I think the amendment essentially does what it requires, is required under the circumstances. We need to stiffen the system that is too readily automatically admitting anybody who applies, whether or not they can show that they have an ability to be successful financially in our country. That's not what the law requires. That's not what we should be doing, and I'd be willing to adjust it at any point later.
The Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's also, in addition to the issue or the situation of a person who is in RPI status who has a child who is a U.S. citizen, so that circumstance has been described, but I believe your amendment, Senator Sessions, also would make it very...
Proceedings under the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection to order, the quorum call is vitiated. Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call up the Feinstein-McCain Amendment number 923 and make it pending.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Excuse me.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you. I just indicated to the senator from Arizona that while I have no objection to having a vote on his amendment, I would ask that he not proceed with his request at this time. So we have a number of crop insurance amendments that we want to do together, and we do have an amendment pending, and so I'm not going to certainly object to voting on his amendment. There is no attempt not to do that, but I would object to having it at this point be the amendment that is pending. But I would ask colleague if he would be willing to work with us, and I would commit to vote on his amendment. This is not an attempt not to vote in his amendment, and I know that my ranking member and I have talked. We certainly are committed to voting on the amendment, but we would like very much to have an opportunity to set up how we will be voting on a series of amendments.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
If I heard the distinguished manager of the bill correctly, he committed to a vote on this amendment. Is that correct?
Correct.
I would ask my colleague.
That is correct.
Is that, and could I ask, Mr. President, I ask you now
Senator from Arizona.
to engage colloquy with the manager.
Without objection, so ordered.
Does that mean that we would vote on this early on?
I think that, I don't know the exact timing. There is no attempt to delay. We're just getting started at this point. I'd be happy to work with you. We certainly are not trying to postpone it to be the last thing, and we certainly can do it earlier rather than later, but we'd just like to have some flexibility to look at a group of amendments that we might vote on that relate to the same subject area. But I absolutely am committing, and I hope I can speak, I believe, on behalf of my ranking member, that we are committing to a vote on the amendment and want to work with you on the timing.
I thank the distinguished manager, and since I have the floor, I would like to make a brief statement about the amendment, and I understand the objection, and I would rely on the good offices of the manager of the amendment and the ranking member that we would have a vote fairly on, not as a last-minute in the rush to complete the bill vote on the amendment. This amendment by Senator Feinstein and myself would eliminate taxpayer-subsidized crop insurance for tobacco. The Congressional Budget Office estimates this amendment would save taxpayers $333 million. That's the estimate of the Congressional Budget Office. It might surprise Americans to know that despite efforts to end traditional farm subsidies for tobacco producers, government handouts for tobacco lives on in the form of highly subsidized crop insurance. Since 2004, we spent more than $276 million on insurance subsidies for tobacco. That's in addition to the $10 billion financed under the tobacco buyout law that Congress passed a decade ago. That law was paid for by assessments on cigarette manufacturers, and it was meant to wean tobacco growers from farm subsidies by buying out their growing quotas. Well, it turns out that Joe Camel's nose has been under the tent all this time in the form of these hidden crop insurance subsidies. As my colleagues know, crop insurance in general has a dubious reputation as a, quote, safety net for farmers because it largely insures against revenue loss instead of crop loss due to weather or pests. According to the Congressional Research Service, taxpayers spending about $14 billion a year to subsidize about 60% of the cost of crop insurance premiums. The federal government also reimburses private crop insurance companies for about 25% of their, quote, administrative and operating costs. We've identified 8 types of tobacco that are eligible for crop insurance: tobacco Maryland, tobacco flue cured, tobacco fire cured, tobacco dark air, tobacco cigar wrapper, tobacco cigar filler, tobacco cigar binder, and tobacco burley. All of these crops remain extremely profitable even without their old farm subsidies. According to reports by the Wall Street Journal and CNBC, tobacco is 10 times more profitable than corn, and most American tobacco is exported. In fact, the value of American tobacco is at a 10-year high since Congress ended traditional tobacco subsidies. It makes no sense to subsidize tobacco insurance considering how well the free market system is working for tobacco producers. I would have a longer statement on this, Mr. President. Last year, the 8 separate tobacco insurance products cost $34.7 million in taxpayer subsidies. Shows that more than the USDA, Department of Agriculture data shows that more than $276 million in taxpayer subsidies have spent on this tobacco subsidy program since 2004. So I would remind my colleagues, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, cigarette smoking adds $96 billion to domestic health care expenses and costs the American economy $97 billion in lost productivity annually. Secondhand smoke adds another $10 billion in health care costs and lost productivity. So clearly, we should be doing nothing to subsidize the production of tobacco. I am not saying that we should ban the growth of tobacco in America. That's a decision that farmers and the market make. But for us to continue to subsidize when these enormous costs are borne by the American people in terms of our health and our economy, it's time we ended it. And I thank the distinguished manager and ranking member for their commitment to having an up or down vote on this amendment. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And under this proposal, a worker would bring a complaint to the Department of Homeland Security, which would have 120 days either to act or decline to act, or in effect remain inert, and then there would be a right of action, but only after that administrative process runs its course. So I ask for support from my colleagues.
Mr. President, I want to take just a moment this afternoon in general to talk about the importance of crop insurance as a risk management tool. I think we'll probably have a lot of discussion on the floor about crop insurance, but we are, as I said earlier, moving away as a matter of policy from direct subsidies, and we certainly haven't subsidized tobacco growers for a long time, and I would not support doing that. We are moving in general away from that into an insurance model, and the cost is shared between the federal government and growers. We want as many growers as possible to purchase crop insurance rather than having a disaster and then wanting us to pass a disaster assistance bill. We didn't have to do that this last time around. I might add, despite the worst drought in 50, 60, 70 years, because crop insurance worked this last year, it covered the losses. And so it's a very important public-private sector process and partnership. And one of my concerns about carving it up or removing one crop or another or putting limits is that we are then moving away from a general policy of insurance, and I think going down a road that would have a lot of implications, and I know that farmers in general would have great concern about. I have a tremendous amount of sympathy and, in fact, agreement with the distinguished senator from Arizona about what he was saying about tobacco, certainly, and the harms to health and so on. When we look overall at crop insurance, the good news is that less than 1% of that whole program, I think substantially less than 1%, is something that in any way covers tobacco. So that's a good thing. The larger question for all of us and for farmers across the country is, are we going to make a commitment broadly to the #1 risk management tool for them? Are we going to make sure that as we say we're not doing subsidies anymore, that we listen to what they're saying about having a crop insurance system? Now, there are parallels between that and flood insurance, and sort of as people are proposing various limits on crop insurance, I think it's important to know, would we put that on other kinds of insurance, flood insurance risk or other things? Insurance deals with risk, and it is more about encouraging farmers to have a stake in the game, to be able to cover part of that risk with their own dollars, rather than it is other kinds of policies that we've debated about subsidies. And so as we go forward, there will be a lot of different discussions about crop insurance. And I would ask colleagues to join with us in resisting efforts to eliminate or limit what is a public-private insurance system that is frankly working very well. And one of the areas that we are so proud about that I mentioned earlier is that we have now seen broadly all of the farm organizations, the commodity groups coming together, just about all of them, to work with the conservation groups and environmentalists to say we're going to together both support an insurance model, a risk management model broadly as a matter of policy for agricultural policy, but we're also going to support linking that to conservation practices. So as you, as a farmer, receive that partnership, you know, the piece that we kick in, with that brings a commitment for conservation practices for our land, for our soil, our water, and so on. This is very, very important. It's not been the case in the last Farm Bill or the Farm Bill before. We haven't seen that kind of link. They've come together and said they support crop insurance broadly as an insurance model without limits that have been proposed by various people. But in return for that, whether it's a very large farm or whether it's a small farm, the broad public benefit of having conservation compliance outweighs many of what we're hearing about in terms of the limits being proposed, in terms of the public good of having crop insurance and having this alliance of crop insurance and conservation compliance. It's a historic agreement, and I stand by that agreement with all of the members and believe that whether we are talking about large farmers or whether we are talking about a small farm, that this is a very important policy and that we need to have conservation compliance involved across the board in our efforts as we expand crop insurance. So we'll have a lot of discussion, a lot of debate on this. I think that it's very tempting to look at one particular crop, certainly a crop that is something that has a lot of health risks related to it, that we have a lot of concerns about in other venues, and say, well, let's just eliminate one crop. The challenge with that, of course, is as a policy around insurance, there will be a deep opposition and concern coming from agriculture, from farmers, large and small, across the country, about starting down that road, no matter how noble the cause in terms of the concern about the risks of that particular crop. And so we'll look forward to more discussion on that, but I do think it's very important to put a broad lens on this. And as we have moved away from subsidies that come regardless of good times or bad, whether they're needed or not, and have moved to a system where we're asking farmers to put some skin in the game. We're saying you've got to get crop insurance, you've got to be a part of paying for it, you don't get any help unless there is a disaster. There is no payout unless there is a disaster. As we move to that broad cornerstone, I would hope that we could keep that in place and not see efforts that will weaken it around the edges and suggest the absence of quorum.
Mr. Alexander.
Ask the question. Where I visited, they literally had no access to a telephone. What we're trying to do is to say, let's at least have a reasonable due process system for those who are being detained over the question of whether or not they should be deported. And that means at least every 90 days to ask, what's happened to this case? Is anything going to happen? Not only the uncertainty of their family, the uncertainty of their future, it costs us money to detain them. $100 to $160 a day to detain them. So what we're trying to do is establish a reasonable due process on the question of detention on status of immigration, separate and apart, totally separate and apart from any adjudication of criminal activity.
Thank you. Are there further discussions? No. Then those in favor of the Grassley Amendment number 47 indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Noes appear to have it. Noes do have it. And I believe, Senator Blumenthal, you have Amendment number 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call Blumenthal 4. This is a very straightforward amendment that very simply requires that the Department of Homeland Security should consult with the Department of Labor when it's developing regulations to implement the anti-trafficking and foreign labor contractor provisions of S-744, Subtitle 3, Title 3, Subtitle F. This amendment, which again was done in consultation with Senator Rubio and our Republican friends in the group of 8, provides for that consultation because the Department of Labor often has expertise and experience in the development of these regulations that apply to foreign labor practices by the recruiters, and really makes use of that experience. So it's a fairly straightforward minor amendment that provides for consulting between the two departments and is supported by both.
We can vote on this. This is simply a requirement of consulting. Is that correct? It's not a veto type.
That is correct.
Thank you. So it sounds unobjectionable to me. Senator Grassley said he's perfectly willing to accept a voice vote. Is there further discussion?
I feel good about the amendment, so it doesn't get, I mean, presumably the Department of Labor has information concerning job needs in America, and that they may counsel Homeland Security, we don't need these workers because we've got a lot of unemployment today. Would they be able to say, Madam Secretary, we don't need any more workers in this area. We've got unemployed Americans that could do this work.
The objective, Senator, is a little bit narrower, namely as to standards of recruitment and fair practices in the industries of recruiting, so that in formulating these standards, the Department of Homeland Security will have the benefit of the Department of Labor's expertise and experience.
Well, I don't have an objection to that. I think it's probably good, but we really need to be enhancing the ability of somebody on behalf of the American worker to say these contractors and their business clients don't get to decide how many people are needed, and really watching it to make sure there's a real need there.
All those in favor of the Blumenthal Amendment number 4 will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and we have now a Senator Sessions. I understand you have an amendment.
Yes. This amendment deals with an issue that I probably would just...
I understand this is Sessions 12?
12. It deals with bonds for aliens from non-contiguous countries. I know Senator Feinstein's worked on this at some length in years past. Perhaps it was just an oversight not to have it in the legislation. But there's a real problem with people who are not contiguous to the United States. It's very expensive to deport them, and how you handle this is a difficult thing, and often it takes a long time for the country to accept them back, and in the meantime they get released on bail and they abscond and just disappear. That's a general serious problem for quite a long time. Language that I've offered was included in immigration reform bills going back to 2005, including an amendment by Senator Feinstein, I believe, in 2006 and 2007.
But this, am I correct on this? This would apply to everybody, sort of one size fits all. Whether even people there's no evidence of a flight risk, no criminal background, no past record, they still would get hit with the same bond.
Yes.
The $5,000 minimum bond, so that we're going to be housing a whole lot of people. Might not be.
Well, perhaps we can move them out more rapidly, but we have a completely failed system when people are not being released on minimum bails and disappearing, and that's what's happening in huge numbers. For example, according to the current Border Patrol daily report as of April, other than Mexican members at the southwest border are up 67% for 2012 to 2013, from 35,000 to 59,000. The Rio Grande Valley sector in South Texas has seen a 98% increase in non-Mexican immigrants. Laredo is 63%, Tucson a 34%. Secretary Napolitano testified last July that terrorists are entering the U.S. via the southwestern border. In fiscal year 2011, 7,518 aliens were apprehended near the border from 4 countries the U.S. lists as state sponsors of terrorism, including Syria and Iran and Sudan. According to the State Department, there are countries where we have concerns, countries with al-Qaeda affiliates. Last November, the Homeland Security Subcommittee published a report in the House that said January 2011, U.S. agents discovered Saeed Jaziri in the trunk of a car trying to enter San Diego. He said he had traveled from his native Tunisia to Tijuana, paid smugglers $5,000 to sneak him across the border. The French government had previously convicted and deported him for assaulting a Muslim whom he considered insufficiently devout. In 2006, he advocated killing Danish cartoonists who published that cartoon and for creating what Jaziri calls sacrilegious drawings. Ahmed Dakhani, a Somali, told authorities in 2011 he earned up to $75,000 a day smuggling East Africans in America into America across the border, and his clients included 3 al-Shabaab terrorists. Dakhani cautioned that each of these individuals is ready to die for their cause and would fight against the United States if jihad moved from overseas to the mainland. And there are a lot of examples. So the problem is plain. We've got a huge number of people that are being released, and at one point the number was like 85% failed to appear at their court date after being released. And that would be particularly true, of course, for real criminals and terrorists. If they have an opportunity to be released under bail and to blend into the community, they'll do so rather than be deported.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feinstein and Senator Coons.
Well, I'm going to support this amendment. I've supported it before, and there's good reason for it. There's evidence of actual and potential terrorists entering via the southwest border, principally members of Hamas and Hezbollah. And without going into intelligence, I'd submit the press about this for the record. In fiscal year 12, there were 35,528 what are called OTMs, other than Mexicans. In 2013, in the fiscal year, there were 59,304. That's a 67% increase in 1 year. It indicates that something that we have feared is that people would recognize that it's easier to come in through the Mexican border if you're coming from a Middle Eastern country or Sudan or any of these other places than it is through a major port of entry. So I think we need to do something about it, and I'm very pleased to support this amendment.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understand correctly, from background I've gotten on this amendment and on this amendment when it was previously adopted by this committee by voice vote during the immigration debate of 2006.
That's right.
At that point, it was considered and adopted in large part in response to the so-called catch and release program in force at the time, where a significant number of other than Mexican migrants were being caught and then literally released without bond, and that program ended shortly thereafter. So this amendment in part responds to a problem that no longer exists in the form it was in 2006. ICE has discontinued that catch and release program, and no alien is today released on recognizance alone without an assessment of flight risk. My impression from looking into this is that, individualized bond determinations are the appropriate way to balance safeguarding public safety and guaranteeing an alien's appearance at a removal proceeding. Minimum bonds apply only to aliens who have not committed any offense that would otherwise subject them to mandatory detention. I understand the impulse to detain everybody pending removal, but such a course of action, I think, today is neither cost-effective or consistent with our values. Bond in the immigration system is designed to ensure an individual's compliance with removal proceedings. And one recent study showed 95% of aliens who posted bond appeared at their next court date. So in my view, there's no need to increase minimum bonds, and this would more than triple the mandatory minimum bond and result in keeping many people who are not flight risks in detention a great deal longer in response to a circumstance and a practice by ICE that is now more than 6 or 7 years out of date. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, as I understand it right now, current law provides for mandatory detention of anyone inadmissible in criminal, national security, or terrorism ground. Is that correct?
I would assume that's correct. I don't know.
I think it's safe to say it is. But what this does so dramatically increases the question of bond and detention for people who have shown no sign or risk of fleeing. They have no criminal records. Somebody who would obviously is going to stay in the area. I think it goes beyond what we have in our current law. It's unnecessary, but does the Senator wish a roll call?
Just one final comment. The $5,000 bond is not unreasonable. The $1,500 bond is awfully low. There's nothing wrong for this country to say, we're going to get tough about this. We've had too much of this problem, and you have to post a reasonable bond, and that's pretty low, actually.
That's right.
And if they have big problems, I think the judge could increase the bond on the current law, too. But that would be the minimum, and I think it's reasonable. And I thank the chair.
Oh, we already...
I would prefer ask for a roll call vote.
Clerk, call the roll.
Aye.
No by proxy. No. No by proxy. No. Senator Klobuchar votes in person. No. No.
Mr. Chairman.
And so it fails on tie. We note Senator Schumer voting in person. So the amendment fails. We next have a one by the senator from Connecticut. Blumenthal 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call Blumenthal 5. And again, want to express my thanks to Senator Rubio and members of the Group of 8 on both sides of the aisle.
Do I understand you have a second-degree amendment to it?
And I ask unanimous consent that the second-degree amendment be adopted.
Without objection, the amendment as amended by the second degree is before the committee, and that's when we will be debating and voting on. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, this amendment again adds some tightening and specificity to a protection already in S-744, Subtitle F, Title III, which contains strong provisions that enable workers to be fully informed about their obligations when they are subject to these kinds of recruiting. There are 3 essential problems that are fixed in the current language by this amendment. First of all, workers cannot be sure in the current language that the contract they receive is the one that they will actually have to comply with when they come here. And so Blumenthal 5 requires that foreign labor recruiters certify to prospective workers that their contracts will not be changed unless workers are given at least 24 hours to review the changes and give fully voluntary consent. And so under this amendment, labor recruiters are prevented from using bait-and-switch tactics. And prospective workers can feel confident that the job they sign up for is the one that they will actually do. Second, the present language in S-744 requires foreign labor recruiters to tell prospective workers how long their visas will last and the terms of that visa. Blumenthal 5 requires the recruiters to tell prospective workers the terms and conditions under which their visas may be renewed. So if they're renewed, and if they're possible to be renewed, the terms and conditions have to be disclosed. And finally, the bill has currently prohibitions on fees, recognizing that very steep recruitment fees are often the first step in increasing a worker's vulnerability to all kinds of exploitation, including debt bondage and other forms of human trafficking. S-744 prohibits those labor recruiters from charging fees to workers either directly or indirectly, and Blumenthal 5 requires an employer to report whether it has paid for a foreign labor's recruiter's services, which allows the Department of Homeland Security to quickly and easily identify instances when a foreign labor recruiter has not received compensation from the employer and may be demanding it from a worker. This is a common-sense amendment, and again, I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their support.
I like the fact that it, it's going to just create one more problem for human traffickers and those who do foreign recruiting in a less than honest way. And I think it's a common sense amendment. I support it. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Senator Lee, I understand that Senator Hatch is still detained. I understand you're going to offer an amendment for him.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Senator Hatch, I'd like to pull up Hatch Amendment number 2.
Hatch Amendment 2 is before the committee.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, in recent years, Mexican drug cartels have been largely responsible for a recent spike in illegal marijuana cultivation on public lands because it saves traffickers the risk and the expense of importing drugs across the border. The cartels use chemicals, they divert water sources to improve their crop at the expense of the environment and at the expense of the integrity of these public lands. We need enhanced penalties for marijuana cultivation on public lands because that will ensure that fewer drugs enter the market and that will protect our natural resources. So this amendment would establish an aggravated penalty for cultivating marijuana on federal lands and would mandate that it be served consecutively to the term of imprisonment for the underlying offense of manufacturing and distribution of a controlled substance. In addition, the amendment implements a 2-level sentence enhancement for the following special offense characteristics: use of poison, chemical, or hazardous substance, diversion of a water source in furtherance of a grow operation on federal land, or the use of or possession of weapons while cultivating marijuana on federal land. I urge my colleagues.
Chairman.
Well, I would indicate that no matter how I might feel about the marijuana laws in this country, I have no interest in helping somebody basically steal our federal lands, steal our federal resources, to do something that is still illegal. So I strongly support the amendment of the senator from Utah and his colleague from Utah, Senator Schumer.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I agree. We don't have too many of these problems in Brooklyn, but this is a needed amendment.
Of this nature.
Of this nature.
Of this nature in Brooklyn, yes.
In part because the state of New York has less than 1/2 of 1% of its land federally owned. Ours in Utah is about almost 70%.
Exactly.
So that explains.
Anyway, it's a serious problem, and I think
both lovely places. Go ahead.
I think Senator Hatch has made a very good addition here, and I hope we can support it on a voice vote quickly.
Yes, I'd like to be a co-sponsor, please, Mr.
No
Chairman.
objection, you are. All those in favor of it signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Again, I would note to everyone, sometimes the very short discussions of amendments, they're the ones that seem to pass quickest. Just saying, no particular message there at all, but as the one person who has to stay here through every bit of this, I just happened to mention that. Senator Blumenthal, you have amendment number 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call Blumenthal 6, which is an amendment that would close the loophole that allows visitors through the visa waiver program to purchase guns. And I want to make clear to my colleagues, I'm not going to ask for a vote on this amendment, nor will I do so on Blumenthal 9, which has a similar objective, which is to make America safer from gun violence. And I feel compelled, Mr. Chairman, I will do this explanation very concisely, I promise. I feel compelled to note that 160 Americans have been killed by guns since we began debating this bill. They're among more than 4,200 Americans that have been killed by gun violence, including 80 children, since the violence, the horrific tragedy in Newtown. I want to just say to my colleagues that I think we have a continuing obligation to use every potential opportunity to stop gun violence and make America safer. This legislation offers such an opportunity. I will be pursuing these amendments, if necessary, on the floor. There are others that I hope will also be offered by myself and my colleagues, and I want to thank my colleagues for their support of common sense, sensible measures in the past. We have not been successful so far, but we're not going away. Essentially, Blumenthal 6 would apply to temporary visitors to the United States that are prohibited from buying firearms in America. Nearly all temporary visitors are prohibited by buying such firearms, but there is a loophole that has resulted from the current structure of the law and a recent regulation from the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel that enables visitors who entered through the visa waiver program, that is entering the United States without a visa, are now able to purchase guns. Blumenthal 6 would generally prohibit the purchase and possession of firearms by non-immigrant aliens, including those from visa waiver countries. Blumenthal 9 would close a separate gap in our current law, which applies to unauthorized immigrants on temporary visas when they purchase firearms. And I want to thank my colleague, Senator Lautenberg, for his work in this area and indicate that the Department of Homeland Security under Blumenthal 9 would be required to notify, or I should say the Attorney General would be required to notify the Secretary of Homeland Security when in effect, a non-eligible immigrant tries to buy a firearm. And that would be a notification going from the Department of Homeland Security, from the Attorney General to the Department of Homeland Security, simply as a matter of information. I will not offer either amendment at this point, but I thank the Chairman for giving me the opportunity to explain these two amendments. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The Senator from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief on it. I thank the Senator from Connecticut, and I support the substance of the amendments which you have introduced. And I think you've made a wise decision, and I know how important the issue of gun safety is to you personally after what your state has been through. Several of my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, have commented that this is the most complete markup of a bill they've ever sat through. We have spent days at it. There's more to come. But it is an exercise which is the best of the Senate as far as I'm concerned. And the decision by Senator Blumenthal, earlier by Senator Whitehouse, not to bring the gun issue into the immigration bill is a decision which does not diminish in any way the importance of gun safety, but tries to make certain that we stay focused on immigration reform to bring this to its conclusion. I would say to my friend from Connecticut, I still stand in support of what you were setting out to achieve. Thank you for raising the issue, and hope that we will find another forum another day.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, may I ask that the pending quorum call be terminated?
Without objection.
Thank you, and may I further ask permission to speak for perhaps as long as, but probably shorter than 20 minutes, as if in morning business?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Every week that we are here, I try to remind this body of the damage that carbon pollution is doing to our atmosphere and oceans. Try to awaken us to our duty